Chapter 21. If a man entice a maid. It was in Kirtland, as we have seen, that Joseph began to tamper delicately with one of the most basic mores in Occidental society. He looked upon that society with a singular detachment that can come only to a man satisfied with his own ultimate authority and possessed by a longing to remold the world closer to his heart's desire. Nothing was so sacred that it could not be recast into a new utility or a new beauty. Monogamy seemed to him, as it has seemed to many men who have not ceased to love their wives, but who have grown weary of connubial exclusiveness, an intolerably circumscribed way of life. "Whenever I see a pretty woman," he once said to a friend, "I have to pray for grace." But Joseph was no careless libertine who could be content with clandestine mistresses. There was too much of the Puritan in him, and he could not rest until he had redefined the nature of sin and erected a stupendous theological edifice to support his new theories on marriage. By the spring of 1840, this edifice was almost complete and had become so integral a part of his metaphysical system that he probably completely lost sight of the fact that it had not figured at all in the original design. Joseph was not given to self-searching, or he might have been troubled by the intensity of his preoccupation with the nature of adultery. But when he described the new patriarchal order of marriage to Parley Pratt during their weeks together in Philadelphia in 1840, it was with the freshness and enthusiasm of a man who had stumbled quite by chance upon an ancient treasure. "He taught me many great and glorious principles concerning God and the heavenly order of eternity," Pratt said. "It was at this time that I received from him the first idea of eternal family organization and the eternal union of the sexes in those inexpressible, endearing relationships which none but the highly intellectual, the refined and pure in heart know how to prize, and which are the foundation of everything worthy to be called happiness." Pratt had buried his first wife, with whom he had been very much in love, and had since remarried. Joseph now promised him that he would have both wives in heaven, provided that he was sealed to them in the temple under the new and everlasting covenant. And since heaven would bless his union with both wives in the hereafter, it could not logically frown on his having more than one wife on earth. There was plenty of precedent for plural marriages in the Old Testament, beginning with Father Abraham, but it was Jacob's polygamous marriages that particularly interested Joseph Smith, and he frequently referred to the new marriage principle as the blessing of Jacob. He was fond of pointing to the commandment in Exodus, "And if a man entice a maid that is not betrothed, and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife." The sin of adultery lay not in the act itself, but of the subsequent desertion. It was the abandonment of the humbled maid that led to the unspeakable evils of prostitution and infanticide. Joseph taught none of this openly, for he feared that polygamy would bring down the wrath of the Gentiles. Until the day it could be publicly proclaimed, any whisper of the doctrine of plural wives must be vehemently denied, and any man caught preaching it without his own personal sanction must be summarily cut off from the church. Eventually all the saints would be taken into his confidence and welded into a force that could oppose any Gentile threat, but until then the little lie must be voiced to protect the great truth. To break the ground before sowing broadcast the seeds of his new doctrine, Joseph's press published a pamphlet in defense of polygamy by one Udny H. Jacob. Jacob produced a document of astonishing sophistication, advocating polygamy not only as the light of Old Testament precedent, but also as a solution for marital incompatibility. "What, although a woman is not known to be an adulteress," he wrote, "yet she may be a perfect devil to her husband, train him in the most imperious manner, despise him in her heart, abuse him before his children, drive him like a menial slave where she pleases, and he must tamely submit to the ungodly law of his wife, must hug the serpent to his bosom, and love her as he does his own body? Impossible, and degrading to the nature of man. Such a wife must not be divorced," he said, "for a divorced man is not known in the whole canon of Scriptures. But for her to continue performing the rituals of the marriage bed without any love for her husband, which he labeled fornication in the wife, was gross sin." In ancient times, under the law of God, he concluded, the permission of plurality of wives had a direct tendency to prevent the possibility of fornication in the wife. Whether Jacob was describing his own married state, or Joseph's, or simply of any poor bedeviled male, one cannot know, but there is no doubt that Jacob looked upon woman as the inferior species. The idea of a woman taking a man to be her husband is not found in the Word of God, but the man marries the woman, and the woman is given in marriage. But the husband is not the property of the wife in any sense of the word. There is no positive law of God against a man's marrying Leah and Rachel both. To God only are men accountable in this matter, and not to their wives. This pamphlet was published in 1842 in Nauvoo under the prophet's auspices. The title page lists J. Smith as printer, although he was quickly forced to denounce it, but it must be considered a mere fragment of his elaborate framework of justification for plural marriage. Paul had said that in heaven there would be no marriage or giving in marriage, but Joseph taught that this would not apply to his saints. That which he and his elders sealed on earth would be binding also in heaven. There a man would not have only his wives and children, but also the prerogative of procreating more, until, as he expressed it to Parley Pratt, the result of our endless union would be offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, or the sands of the seashore. This was the road to godhood. A man's glory in the next world would be determined by the knowledge that he had gained and the excellence of his works upon the earth. He who entered heaven with 10 talents would have tenfold the glory of man with 1, and his rate of progress towards godhood would be 10 times as rapid as that of the man who had been blind to the truth upon earth. Similarly, if a man went to heaven with 10 wives, he would have all the more tenfold the blessings of a mere monogamist, for all the children begotten through these wives would enhance his kingdom. The man with only 1 wife, on the other hand, would be denied even her and forced to spend eternity as a ministering angel rather than a god. Joseph taught that God himself was once as we are now, and is an exalted man. He had increased in skill and wisdom until he had come to govern myriads of worlds peopled by spirits of his own procreation. Ahead of every man there stretched this same boundless opportunity for progression throughout eternity. The rate of his spiritual growth would accelerate in direct proportion to the speed with which he accepted God's laws and performed God's rituals. Lorenzo Snow caught in the essence of this philosophy in a terse and provocative line. As man is, God once was, and as God is, man may become. It was the most challenging concept that Joseph Smith ever produced, and in a sense, the most original. It will be seen that the Mormon heaven was as changing, tumultuous, and infinitely varied as earth itself. Converts reared on a diet of harps and angels found this heaven exciting. To those infected with the prodigious optimism and enthusiasm of America, it seemed only reasonable that there need be no end of the explorations of the human spirit. To men who loved their wives, it was pleasant to hear that death was no separation, and to men who did not, it was gratifying to hear that there could be no sin in taking another. To every man in love with life, with the tantalizing richness of learning, the sweaty satisfaction of hard work, the luxury of sensual pleasure, Joseph's heaven had profound meaning. Although many of the leading Mormon officials converted their first wives to polygamy before taking a second, Joseph did not take Emma into his confidence. Neither did he confide in his friends. There was disagreement among them in the later years, even over the identity of his first plural wife. Some, like Benjamin Johnson, were certain that it had been Fanny Alger, who had, after being expelled from Joseph's home in Kirtland, had gone to Indiana, where she married and raised a large family. But others held that plural marriage was not officially inaugurated until April 5, 1841, the eve of the 11th anniversary of the founding of the church, when he married the attractive 26-year-old Louisa Beeman. But it is doubtful if Louisa was even second on the list. The most famous woman in the church was William Morgan's widow, Lucinda, now married to George W. Harris, one of Joseph's key men, and incidentally, a Mason of high rank. Although now almost 40, the small, bright, blue-eyed Lucinda had lost little of her blonde beauty. It happened that she and Sarah Pratt were good friends, and she is said to have admitted to Miss Pratt in 1842 that she had been the prophet's mistress since 4 years. Mormon historians, although listing Mrs. Harris as one of Joseph's plural wives, have been reluctant to admit the authenticity of Sarah Pratt's statement, since its implications are embarrassing, but they supply no date of the marriage ceremony, and it would appear that if indeed any ceremony was performed at all, it took place in Far West in 1838, when the prophet was living in the Harris home. The extreme informality attending Joseph's earliest marriages, at least as it appears in the available records, is even more evident in the story of the prophet's relationship with Prescindia Huntington Buell. During the Missouri troubles of 1838-1839, her husband, Norman Buell, temporarily left the church. About this time, Prescindia bore a son. She admitted later that she did not know whether Norman Buell or the prophet was the father, but the physiognomy revealed a rare photograph of Oliver Buell that seems to weight the balance overwhelmingly on the side of Joseph's paternity. And there is evidence in the diary of the boy's uncle, Oliver Huntington, that young Buell was later officially sealed or adopted to the prophet in Mormon Temple in Salt Lake City. However, Prescindia seems not to have been married to Joseph Smith officially until December 11, 1841, sometime after this child was born. She remained nominally Miss Buell and lived with Norman Buell in Lima, Illinois, until a year and a half after Joseph's death, when she left Buell permanently and became a plural wife of Heber C. Kimball. Before the expulsion of John C. Bennett in 1842, Joseph had been married or sealed to an imposing list of women, almost all of them already married. In addition to Louisa Beeman, Mrs. Harris, and Mrs. Buell, there were Mrs. Zina Huntington Jacobs, Mrs. Mary Rollins Leitner, Mrs. Patty Sessions, possibly Mrs. Clarissa Hancock, and Mrs. Sally Gully, and probably Mrs. Nancy Hyde, with a doubtful Mrs. Durfee at the bottom of the list. There were undoubtedly others, for John C. Bennett, who knew of several of these marriages, hinted at others which cannot be identified from available documents. Most attractive of all these women was the vivacious 20-year-old Zina Huntington Jacobs, whom Joseph had taken into his home for a time during the Great Plague of 1840. Zina had been married to Henry B. Jacobs on March 7, 1841, and at the time of her sealing to Joseph, on October 27, 1841, she was 7 months pregnant with Jacob's child. Jacobs then apparently knew nothing of this special ceremony, for when he toured southern Illinois with John D. Lee in the winter of 1842, he talked constantly of his wife's loveliness and fidelity. Zina's marriage with Jacobs proved unhappy, although she did not leave him until 1846, shortly before the birth of her second son, when she became one of the already numerous wives of Brigham Young. Only one of these married women described Joseph's courtship. This was Mary Elizabeth Rollins, who had adored Joseph from the time of her adolescent conversion in New York State and who was now married to the friendly but non-Mormon Adam Leitner. Although not married to Joseph Smith until February 1842, Mrs. Leitner reported that Joseph told her he had been commanded to take her for a wife as early as 1834. "I was then 1,000 miles from him," she wrote. "He got afraid. The angel came to him 3 times, the last time with a drawn sword, and threatened his life." When Joseph told her about the angel in 1842, she refused to believe him. If God told him so, why did he not come and tell me? The angel told him I should have a witness. An angel came to me. It went through me like lightning. I was afraid. Joseph said I was his before I came here, and he said all the devils in hell should never get me from him. I was sealed to him in the Masonic Hall over the brick store by Brigham Young in 1842 February. The men who were taken into the system at this early period, Hiram Smith, Brigham Young, Heber Kimball, William Clayton, Willard Richards, and Benjamin F. Johnson, after an initial period of shock and spiritual torment, were won over with very little argument. Joseph's brother Don Carlos fought polygamy before his death in 1841. "Any man," he said to Ebenezer Robinson of June of that year, "who will preach and practice spiritual wifery will go to hell, no matter if it is my brother Joseph." But William Smith was an eager convert. His first plural wife was Mary Ann Sheffield, who had left a husband in England. "I never met William Smith but once before I married him," she related. "I met him coming down from Keokuk. I think that was in April 1843. I do not know if I lived with him 2 weeks. Cannot tell whether I lived with him 1 week or not." Before the death of his first wife in 1845, William took at least 4 other plural wives. But the true measure of the magnetism of plural marriage can be best seen in the attitude of the Mormon women. They required very little more persuasion than the men, though the reasons are not so obvious. Nauvoo was a severe town, puritanical and acutely self-righteous, but it was a town full of church widows, whose husbands were out proselyting, spreading the gospel in the East and the South, in Canada and in England. Several were making ready to go to the South Sea Islands. Orson Hyde, on the way to Palestine to dedicate that land to the restoration of the Jews, was exploring the possibilities of missions in Germany and Russia. Whether Nancy Hyde became a polygamous wife of Joseph Smith when Orson Hyde was on this mission, or earlier, is not clear, but her circumstances were typical of those of many women who found polyandry to their liking. Moreover, Nauvoo was troubled by the old problem of the separated but undivorced female convert. Divorce was usually impossible, and so many women were pouring into Nauvoo eager to marry again that it was difficult for the church to maintain the discipline that would have been normal in a settled community. Marriage standards were extremely flexible all along the frontier. It was easy, therefore, for many of the penniless and lonely women converts to slip into polygamy, but for every woman who entered the system for reasons of security, and a fragile security at that, there were a dozen for whom this necessity did not arise. There was no need whatever for the attractive virgin to become a second, third, or 13th wife, since frontier areas always had a surplus of men. And what of the married women who gladly signed themselves and their children over to the prophet's keeping in glory for eternity, leaving their unwitting husbands to be wifeless and childless in the celestial kingdom? Was this a melancholy commentary on their own marriage state, or a tribute to Joseph's charm? Or was it perhaps a smothered yearning for new experiences, released now by opportunity masquerading as religious duty? It should have been obvious to Joseph that polygamous marriages could not be long kept a secret, and soon the first fruits of spiritual wifery began to appear. Up to this time, Joseph had taken care that almost all his own plural wives were married women, but his leading elders could not easily follow his example. No one in the whole of Nauvoo had a more strategic vantage point from which to discover exactly what was going on than the famous midwife Patty Sessions. A slim, wiry woman with hands admirably small for her work, she delivered babies for fees ranging from 50 cents to $3 and was more esteemed than any other doctor in the city. In the spring of 1842, Joseph added her to his circle of wives. Her daughter Sylvia, who stood as witness at the marriage of her mother, also became his wife, but this apparently Patty never knew. She recorded her own marriage proudly in her secret journal, and from that moment forward knew her duty to the new order. Joseph H. Jackson, who claimed to have been in the prophet's confidence for a time, stated that Mrs. Sessions, Mrs. Durfee, and a Mrs. Taylor were called mothers in Israel, and their duty was to instruct the younger women in the mysteries of polygamy. Whether Mrs. Taylor became a wife of the prophet is not known. After the expulsion of John C. Bennett, the blame for the fatherless children arriving in the city was laid at his door. But while he was in power, suspicion fell on every man who was seen out after curfew. The number of first wives who knew about the truth about polygamy was then extremely small, and the remainder were seething with suspicion and furiously angry at what seemed to be the appalling moral laxity in Nauvoo. The Female Relief Society, which Joseph had organized in mid-March 1842 with Emma as president, was quickly diverted from charitable offices to the purging of iniquity, with a passion that probably came less from her exalted standards of moral behavior than from an unuttered dread of what she might discover. Emma probed and questioned every woman who came into the organization. Assisting her in the leadership of the society were some of the ablest women in the church: Mrs. Elizabeth Ann Whitney, Mrs. Sarah M. Cleveland, Elvira Cowles, and the poetess Eliza R. Snow. Joseph publicly commended them for their zeal in making a select society of the virtuous, but warned them that they must be extremely careful in their examinations, or the consequences would be serious. Eventually, every one of these women became his plural wife, with the exception of Mrs. Whitney, who granted him instead the privilege of marrying her 17-year-old daughter, Sarah. The practice of enlarging the circle of wives in order to win the loyalty of influential Nauvoo women was effective up to a point, after which it became highly dangerous. Sooner or later, some woman would be sufficiently revolted by polygamy to tell the whole world about what was going on in Nauvoo. Mrs. Sarah M. Kimball, whom Joseph approached in 1842, told him to teach the concept to someone else, but she kept silent. Mrs. Orson Pratt, who also refused the prophet, confided in a few friends, but did not discuss polygamy publicly until she was an embittered and lonely old woman. But a self-possessed 18-year-old English girl, Martha Brotherton, chose to speak her mind. Brigham Young, who had not been lax in following his prophet's lead, had set his heart on the high-spirited English lass. He took her to the famous rendezvous over Joseph's store, locked the door, and proceeded with the curious bob-tailed hortatory courtship that was becoming so common in the day. Brother Joseph has had a revelation from God that it is lawful and right for a man to have 2 wives. If you will accept of me, I will take you straight to the celestial kingdom. And if you will have me in this world, I will have you in that which is to come. And Brother Joseph will marry us here today, and you can go home this evening, and your parents will not know anything about it. When the girl demurred and begged for time, Brigham called in Joseph, who also urged her to make an immediate decision. "Just go ahead and do as Brigham wants you to," he said, and added with a laugh, "He is the best man in the world, except me." Then he went on more seriously, "If you will accept of Brigham, you shall be blessed. God shall bless you, and my blessing shall rest upon you. And if you do not like it in a month or 2, come to me, and I will make you free again. And if he turns you off, I will take you on." "Sir, it will be too late to think in a month or 2 after," Martha answered wryly. "I want time to think first." To this the prophet replied, "But the old proverb is, 'Nothing ventured, nothing gained.'" Finally and reluctantly they let her go home, where she promised to pray in secret for guidance. The moment she arrived, however, she wrote down the whole episode while it was still fresh in her memory, and showed it to her parents. The Brothertons in high dudgeon took a steamboat to St. Louis, but not before they had given Martha's recital enough circulation so that everyone in Nauvoo knew it within a week. Eventually, Martha published her account in a St. Louis newspaper. But even before it appeared, Joseph had taken measures to kill the rumors her departure had set in motion. Hiram at the April conference contradicted the report that a sister had been shut in the room for several days, and that they endeavored to induce her to believe in having 2 wives. The 12 apostles all testified that Joseph's principles were strictly virtuous, and Joseph himself took the stand in a blistering sermon against all adulterers and fornicators who were making use of his name to sanction their corruption. We have among us, he said, in part, thieves, adulterers, liars, hypocrites. If God should speak from heaven, he would command you not to steal, not to commit adultery, not to covet nor deceive, but be faithful over a few things. As far as we degenerate from God, we descend to the devil and lose knowledge, and without knowledge we cannot be saved. The church must be cleansed, and I proclaim against all iniquity. A man is saved no faster than he gets knowledge. Joseph could, with a certain honesty, inveigh against adultery in the same week that he slept with another man's wife, or indeed several men's wives, because he had interposed a very special marriage ceremony. And who was to say him nay, since in the Gentile world the simple pronouncement of a few time-worn phrases by any justice of the peace was all that was necessary to transform fornication into blessed matrimony. The spoken word stood between him and his own guilt, and with Joseph the word was God.